It's called the Grocery Code of Conduct, and it came into effect this month in January 2026. I never ever heard about that on the news and have written or asked, what is it exactly? Is it effective? How does it work? So I thought we should go over that just a bit so we would understand. It's not the grocery store code of conduct, it's the grocery code of conduct. In other words, it's talking more about supply chains and sometimes the blocks and other things that happen that keep food from getting to us the way that with more choices that we might like. It began in 2020. This is the pandemic time. And all of a sudden, supply chains were kind of badly interrupted. We know about that. We all went through that at the time. What began to happen there was that a lot of the main grocery chains in Canada began to dominate the system. Independent suppliers, local farmers, local markets, and others were having great difficulty getting product to sell to people. Often that product was cheaper than it would have been in grocery stores, and yet they were having trouble getting supplies. So as the years moved forward and as the pandemic waned and then eventually closed, a desire was put out there that we need a code of conduct so that the large supply chains and grocery chains, and there are 5 of them, will cooperate in making sure that there will be access for smaller independent groups to be able to get the supplies that they require. Now, we should honestly just admit that the playing field about groceries and those kind of things in Canada is not at all level, and it probably never will be. But what this is doing is it is trying to provide some guarantees so that the smaller independent chains can stay on that same field, tough as that is, market their products, sell it to local citizens and organizations, and hopefully be able to stay in the game and make a living out of doing it. It's an important piece. It's not law. There's no way of really coming down and fining or barring somebody or whatever it is. But there is a dispute mechanism put within it. So if you were a small independent grocer and all of a sudden you had trouble, let's say, getting fresh produce or whatever it is that you would be selling it, and you can't get it, and yet the large chains seem to have no problem. They've dominated. They've got monopolies over all of that. In 2020, there was a general admission that what happened with the pandemic is it brought out in more bold relief the inequities within the food system. That happened in a lot of different ways. We know that about homelessness. We know that about food banks and others. A lot of inequities showed up in almost on steroids during the pandemic, that people had to acknowledge that the real seeds of that were there before the pandemic, but the pandemic put them under a broad spotlight. And now we could see it. So the same thing has now happened around groceries and food supplies. So there is a dispute mechanism. So if you were a grocer in London and a small independent one, and suddenly you were having trouble getting some food when others did, you could go to that dispute mechanism and say that you wanted that looked into. At that point, an inspector would come in, being mandated to do so, and see what is the problem here? How come a larger chain can get it, but the smaller chains can't at all? If it's discovered that the larger chains kind of squeeze the independent personnel, made sure that they didn't get that product, then there was kind of sanctions that could be put on that, but it wasn't law. And that is the difficulty. However, the Grocery Code of Conduct is a start. It was late in getting started here in Canada. It's in other places of the world, like Britain, Australia, and others. But at least it's now got started. And its goal is not to come up with everything in the first year in January of 2026, as we're talking here. Its goal is now to build it up over time and see what can be done now to give small independent grocers more of a chance, and also allow us as consumers to be able to buy cheaper product if it is out there. We would like that freedom to be able to do so. That is what the grocery store conduct is. The UK and Australia have been on this journey longer than we have here in Canada. They had exactly the same problems, but they've been at it longer. So their starts were similar to ours. Because they've been at it longer, things have changed. The Code of Conduct now has regulations It has regulators. It has penalties that can be enforced if a monopoly is trying to take over and squeeze out somebody that's smaller. Now, these have begun to have an effect, and there's been an admission on both countries, the UK and Australia, that it has begun to have an effect. It's not just that more smaller independent chains are appearing, it's that they're able to last in such a competitive global market. These two countries, because it's been going longer, have been able to put some real teeth into their codes of conduct around groceries. And that set of teeth has all of a sudden made the larger chains realize that there is a penalty to be paid if they seek to go on and continue to monopolize. So the changes have begun in both of those countries. They've had good effect. They have been researched. They've been looked at at groups like the BBC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and others have done studies on it to see what kind of effect it's had after these number of years. And it's been positive. But they began the same way that we did. So the key now is we have to keep up the pressure, which is what happened in those two other countries. We have to keep up the pressure that what has now begun with the grocery code of conduct here in Canada now moves forward to what it was designed for, which is penalties, which was being able to monitor, which was creating openness for other independent, not just grocers, but local independent farmers who wish to take part in a system like London and be able to sell their food at markets. The grocery code of conduct is now here. It began just a few days ago, but it'll take a few years before these enforcement mechanisms and guidelines come along. It is important to say that of the 5 main grocery chains in Canada, 3 of them have signed on to this code willingly. They did so at the beginning. Now, did they do that for PR reasons or whatever? I don't fully know. I don't know what the rationale was behind that. But the point is they have joined in. You know that we as food banks across the country, but definitely London Food Bank, we are in most grocery stores. And it's important to remember that the managers of those stores who we know well, the workers of those stores who we know even better, these folks participate every year in the different food drives that go on in order to help the London Food Bank. They also identify certain products. They help us by putting bins in the store. These folks were never an issue. They always believed that food should be available to everybody. And they get just as bent out of shape as we do that now 1 out of every 4 London kids is food insecure. They are doing what they can to make a difference. And I must say, they've been doing it for 35 years. Those people are key partners to the food bank, and we take our hats off to them because sometimes it hasn't been easy for them. But we're talking about the corporate offices. These are the ones that have inched forward a little bit and have begun to say that they will be open to a mechanism that will look at the system that's out there, the grocery system, and where there's any pinching going on or any interference with somebody that's smaller, being a grocer or a producer or a seller like an independent store, that these folks have a dispute mechanism where they can go and then it gets put out there. Hopefully within 2 or 3 years, teeth will be put to that. There will be penalties for a larger chain that does that. There'll be penalties also for a smaller chain that does it and tries to keep others from coming in its neighborhood. This is a good thing, but it's toothless. But the intent is there. And if the other 2 countries, the UK and Australia, are any indication, we are on the right track. We need cheaper food for consumers. There's lots of it out there. We need more independent dealers who can give us these things, whether they're independent grocery stores, smaller markets appearing in neighborhoods, or whatever it is. And definitely farmers and growers who aren't part of that big, huge globalized system, who would like instead to bring their product into a place like London and be able to sell it to average people like us who would love to have locally grown food. It's a good thing. It's called the Grocery Code of Conduct. It began in January 1st. Our job now, yours and ours, is to make sure that the process continues, that the meetings continue to happen, that governments and independent sellers and growers are all part of that process. And then hopefully we'll get to a point where it's with enough understanding going on that pretty soon we'll be seeing more of an abundance of local and independent grocery store people. And also the ones that we already have will be able to last on that view. We need them. These are tough times. Groceries are expensive. And it's time we had a grocery code of conduct that gave us those various choices. We see it as a good thing at the London Food Bank, and we definitely support it.